Hi, welcome back. This is section 1.4, and I'm going to do just one example from each of the different properties that we are going to use. If you have looked at the homework, it does say that if you use any other method, then that will not get you any credit. I do want to make sure that you understand how to use each of these because we will use them in different capacities later on in the semester. So first off, the zero factor property. Now the key word here is factor. I want you to factor. I want to see the factors of this. And there are a number of different ways, and I will, in the comments, I will put some links to some other videos that I've made that review a little more of the factoring and the different methods you can use. I don't care what method you use. I'm going to go ahead and use the AC, or the grouping method is typically the most common. So that's the one that I'm going to use here. So for the AC method, we're going to multiply A times C. So that's A times C is, in this case, negative 42. And then we want to find factors of negative 42 that add to B. So the factors of negative 42, well, we've got 2 and negative 21. Those don't add to negative 11. We've got 3 and negative 14. Those will work. That is what we want, is the 3 and negative 14. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace negative 11 with 3 and negative 14. So 2x squared minus 3x, positive 3, negative 14x minus 21, and that's still equal to 0. We're not changing anything. We're just breaking this up. And then I'm going to factor by grouping. So I'm going to look at the first group and the second group. Pay attention to your signs on this. If you factor out a negative number, make sure you change your sign. If we look at this first group here, our GCF is an x. That's all they have in common. When we factor that out, we're left with 2x plus 3. Between negative 14x and negative 21, though 14 and 21 are both factors, both multiples of 7, and we want to go ahead and factor out a negative, because what we want is 2x plus 3. So if we factor out a negative 7, we do end up with 2x plus 3. If these two inside the parentheses are not exactly the same, then there's something wrong. Either it can't be factored by grouping, or that you made a mistake at some point. And so now we're going to factor out the GCF. What these have in common, these both have a 2x plus 3. And what we're left with when we do that is x minus 7. Now, like I said, I don't care what method you use in order to get to this point, as long as I see this point. There's some people that can do it in their head, use a trial and error method. That's the way I was taught when I was in high school. This is what I learned the first time I taught intermediate algebra. And then there's the amazing method, there's the box method. There's a number of different ways that you can get to these factors, but I want to see these factors. Okay, and then now we can use a zero factor property, which says that if we have two things multiplied together and equal 0, that means that one or both have to be equal to 0. And so we can just have simple linear equations. We're going to subtract 3 and divide by 2. On this one, we're going to add 7. And all of these, you can check your answers by going back and plugging them in for the x here. And they should work. All right, now let's look at another one. Let's look at the square root property. The square root property works really nice when we have just one x. When we have just one x, we want to isolate that x. And this is a square, so the opposite of squaring something is taking the square root. What we do to one side, we have to do to the other. since we took the square root, we introduced the square root, we've got to have plus or minus there. Okay, the square root of a quantity squared is technically the absolute value, but that's why we put the plus or minus there. So we get just what's under the radical, and then on the right-hand side, we have the square root of 20, and we can reduce that. We want to know what the biggest perfect square that goes into 20 is 4, and then we've got a 5 left over. So simplify that radical. Square root of 4 is 2, and then the 5 is going to stay underneath the square root. And then now we just want to solve for x. I'm going to add 1, and I'm actually, normally we put it on the right-hand side. I'm actually going to put it in the front because of this plus or minus. And then our last step is to isolate that x by dividing by 4. And you can leave it like this, or you can split it up. The one thing you cannot do unless you split it up is to divide out a 2. We don't have a 2 that we can pull out of all 3 terms. So you can leave it like this, or you can split it up and write it as 1/4 plus or minus. And then you can reduce that fraction and write it as square root of 5 over 2. I am perfectly fine with you leaving it together. All right. Let's see if I can do one more before I hit the timer on this video. So solve by completing the square. Okay, when we're completing the square, our goal is to get something that looks like what we started this last example with. We want to get a perfect square, a trinomial that factors to the perfect square. And so in order to do that, we want to get all of our x's on one side, and then I'm going to leave that 18 on the other side. And I'm going to leave a little blank right there because we're going to add something to make this a perfect square. So our goal is to make this a perfect square. When we want something, remember if you have a plus b quantity squared, if you FOIL that out, you're going to get a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. Well, what we have, this part right here, is our a squared plus 2ab. So what we need to do to figure out our b squared is we need to solve this for b effectively. So we're going to take that middle term and we're going to divide by 2 because our x is our a. And so we're going to divide by 2 so we get just b by itself and then square it. So that's our kind of our magic value. So what we want to multiply here is b over 2 quantity squared. So b over 2 quantity squared, in this case our b is -10. So what we're going to add in here is -10 over 2 squared. What we do to one side, we have to do to the other. So -10 over 2 squared is 25. And then we can factor this left-hand side. So factors of 25 that add to -10. Well, that's x minus 5 and x minus 5. And so we can write that as x minus 5 squared. And then on the right-hand side, when we combine like terms, that's going to be 7. And then now we're starting this one exactly where we started this one. So we're ready to take the square root of both sides. Remember, when you take the square root, you got to take the plus or minus. And we can't simplify that, and so our last step is just to add 5 to both sides. All right, I will catch you guys in the next video.